In this section of the lecture, we'll be talking about Japan's first phase of industrialisation from the late 19th century through to World War II. Japan is notable for being the first non-Western economy to industrialise. Its transformation from a feudal economy to an industrialised economy was remarkably rapid and was to have major consequences for the balance of political power around the world and for events in international relations in the first half of the 20th century. We'll see that studying this phase of Japanese economic development consolidates some of the lessons we've learned about the determinants and main themes associated with the experience of economic development. But we'll also see that the story of Japan refines and elaborates on that story in a variety of ways. So start off with a note on geography. There's several important features of Japan's geography that you need to understand as background to the Japanese experience of economic development. First of all, Japan is a relatively small country. So here are the Japanese islands, location near Korea, Russia, China. Japan's land mass is only about the same amount of land as California in the United States. Japan is not a country that is rich in natural resources, and 65% of the land mass is forested, which means there's limited amounts of land for agricultural activity. Other thing to note about Japan is its closeness to its neighbours. So the idea of military security or national security has always been an important theme tied up with Japanese economic development. The desire to avoid colonisation by its powerful neighbours. As the quote that I've included here from W.J. Macpherson points out, Japan is a notable case of economic development because of its geography. That Japan demonstrates that whereas when we've talked about, say, Britain and the United States, that their economic development can be seen in some ways to be associated with being rich in resources, Japan has a poor resource base and scarce cultivatable land. Yet those did not prove insuperable obstacles to economic development. So Japan's geography is important both in terms of understanding aspects of the course to economic development it followed. The way economic development was tied up with the desire for national security. But when we sort of widen our focus and think about Japanese experience compared to other countries, Japan also becomes a notable case in that its lack of resources and lack of cultivable land make it a different case to the other developed economies, or at least some of the major developed economies that we've talked about so far. A major turning point in Japanese history and economic history was the Meiji Restoration in 1868. So prior to this Meiji Restoration in the Tokugawa era, Japan was a feudal society divided into castes. There was the Tokugawa shogun, the daimyo noble class who essentially controlled the lands. There was the samurai military class, there were artisans and merchants, and at the bottom of the pecking order were the peasants. And the peasants were mainly working in agriculture. This was primarily an agricultural economy. And the upper classes in the society were basically, their operations and activities were financed by taxing the agricultural activity of the peasants. So about 40% of the rice produced by the peasants was taken by the upper classes, the shogun, the daimyo, the samurai, to finance their activities. Japan was an isolationist country, so after 1642 they had basically cut off relations with other countries around the world. That was done to sort of forestall change and preserve the status quo, but of course it meant that Japan missed out on the technological developments that were beginning to happen in the rest of the world, well, in particular in Europe, at around this time. during the couple of hundred years before the Meiji Restoration in 1868, Japan's mainly an agricultural economy that exhibits only slow development. So there's some innovation in agriculture, introduction of irrigation systems, new types of seeds, improvements to soil quality, and that does allow the population to increase between about 1600 and 1700. But for a couple of hundred years before 1868, economic development is relatively static in Japan. At the same time, it's important to recognise that despite this slow development, the Japanese society in the Tokugawa era did exhibit or had many of the preconditions that were necessary for economic growth to commence. So, for example, it did have a relatively developed agricultural sector. It had a population who, by the standards of the day, were relatively well educated. And Japan also had the advantage of being one country. It was relatively homogeneous, both in culture and language, and there weren't barriers to trade within the country. So while development had been slow before the Meiji Restoration, in some ways all that was required was removing sort of a series of institutional impediments in order for economic growth to commence. The breakdown of the Tokugawa shogunate, which occurs and leads to the Meiji Restoration, occurred due to several factors. There were tensions between the different classes in the society. For example, the samurai were trying to get access to more resources, which meant that they were putting extra pressure on the peasants to take more of their rice. The merchant and artisan or chonin class were wanting to remove a lot of the institutional restrictions that were preventing them from engaging in a more thoroughgoing way in commerce. There was a series of national disasters that adversely affected living standards in Japan. There was Admiral Perry's black ships sailing into Tokyo Harbour in 1853 and establishing that Japan, by its isolationist stance, has really slipped well behind other countries in military technology, and for that reason its national security is significantly now threatened by other countries having this much more advanced technology. And around this time, in the mid-19th century, there's also a revival of Japanese nationalism in the form of Shintoism. So the breakdown of the Tokugawa shogunate is really sort of a confluence or a culmination of a variety of factors which undermine that system. And in the end, it's a relatively dramaless transition to the new system of government with the Meiji Restoration. This is one of Admiral Perry's black ships, the USS Susquehanna. It was one of 4 ships that sailed into Tokyo Harbour, and because of the military technology that they had, they were able to basically force the Japanese to agree to a treaty which opened up to international trade with a variety of Western powers. The Meiji Restoration, Meiji means enlightened government. It established the emperor, Emperor Mutsuhito, who would remain emperor until 1912, and an oligarchy of reformers who were intent on transforming Japan into a manufacturing power. So the Meiji Restoration, it doesn't bring a democratic system of government. It basically is an oligarchy. It's an oligarchy who, for example, because of the recognition of Japan's military and therefore national or military inferiority and therefore national insecurity, are really intent on transforming Japan into being a manufacturing power. In the next section of this part of the lecture, I'm going to just give a little brief overview of the patterns of economic growth during this period. from the Meiji Restoration in 1868 through to the early 20th century. So two main features I'll look at. First of all, the fact that there was high rates of economic growth that were underpinned by Japan becoming a more industrialised economy and increasingly engaging with the international economy. And with that, we'll see went population growth. So in this chart, what I've done is, for each of the decades from the 1870s through to the 1920s, I've shown the average annual rate of growth in GDP per capita, as well as in the bottom row, I've shown the average over the whole of that 60-year period. And a couple of things from this. One is, so over the whole period, you can see Japan's rate of economic growth per year is 1.5%. That was a rapid rate of economic growth by the standards of the late 19th and early 20th century. To see that, remember, this was the period of time when the United States was emerging as the world's leading economy. And basically during this period, Japan's rate of economic growth in GDP per capita matches that in the United States. And so, because the United States was the leader, not surprisingly, if Japan's growing at the same rate, it's going to be growing more rapidly than other countries, for example, the United Kingdom. So during this period, Japan's economic growth is taking off. It's keeping pace with the United States. It's still a long way below the United States because it's starting from a lower base in terms of its level of GDP, but it's catching up to other developed economies like the United Kingdom in its level of GDP per capita. This table makes the point that this was a period when Japan was industrialising. So if you want to understand why is it that Japan had that high rate of economic growth that was shown in the last slide, well, a lot of the story was about the changing composition of Japanese economic activity away from agriculture. You can see from the 1880s through to the 1930s, agriculture falling by about 10%, service sector falling a little bit as well, and basically the proportion of Japanese output in manufacturing is doubling over this period from 18% to 36%. So this is a period where Japan increasingly becomes a producer of industrial goods, and that underpins a rapid rate of growth in its GDP per capita. In this graph I've shown population, and let's think of sort of 1870 when the Meiji Restoration, about when that starts, as being a benchmark. And you can see that in the 50 years before the Meiji Restoration, population hasn't increased much at all, maybe by sort of 4 or 5 million during that 50 years. But then if we compare 1870 through to 1920, you can see that during that period when Japan starts to develop economically, the population's increasing by about 20 million and then continuing through to the 1930s. So with Japan's development economically comes substantial growth in its population. That Japanese economic development would have been driven by a change in the composition of economic activity, a shift of resources from agriculture to industry, is a theme that's familiar to us from our study of Western European economic development. There are also, however, aspects of Japanese economic development that are highly distinctive. So, for example, as William Lockwood, who's studied this period of Japanese economic development, notes in this quote, two distinctive aspects of the experience of economic development in Japan are first of all the nexus between economic development and state power and military expansion. The idea that a significant motivation for economic development is the growth of state power and Japan's national security. The second point that Lockwood notes here is the idea that a distinctive aspect of Japanese economic development is the formation of what he calls great financial combines, which became important in the development of large-scale industry, trade and finance, a group in this period that are known as the Zaibatsu, that we'll talk about a little later in this section of the lecture. What I'm going to do now is to give a brief perspective on the evolution of Japanese development during this period. From 1860 to 1890, it was a period of institutional reform, of changing the institutions so that they were more conducive to economic development. So during this period, the lands that had been held by the nobles, the shogun and the daimyo, were passed back to the emperor. The samurai class were paid off, and a new army was constituted. The caste distinctions that had existed in Japanese society were abolished. Peasants were given greater security of tenure, ownership of their land holdings, and the tax system was changed from being a tax on output to being a land-based tax. Surplus from agriculture during this period was ploughed back to finance public infrastructure and the beginnings of manufacturing industry. And there was a huge emphasis on education in Japan. So between 1870, in 1870 there was 2.5% of the Japanese population in schooling and education. By 1930, that proportion has increased to 17.5%. In the period from 1890 to 1920, Japan emerges as a leading industrial manufacturer of textiles, silk and cotton. There's a variety of factors underpin that. First of all, Japan itself is becoming, with the larger population, a large market, and Japan opens up to international trade during this period as well. Japan has a large supply of low-skill labour that can be used in producing textiles, a labour-intensive manufacturing industry. And Japan also successfully brings in and adapts technologies from the rest of the world for producing cotton. Because Japan is a different economy in terms of being a low-wage economy, they're able to change the way in which they apply the capital equipment. For example, because they're a low-wage economy, they're able to do things like run double shifts, thereby getting more usage out of the capital equipment that they're buying. From the 1920s onwards, Japan starts to shift towards what we might call heavier industry or heavy manufacturing. In the period up to 1920, there'd been the beginnings of the iron and steel industry. The Japanese government had tried to subsidise the development of a shipbuilding industry. But in the 1920s, this starts to happen in a more thoroughgoing and extensive way. And Japan starts to move into the areas such as chemicals, metals and machinery, which are seen as the higher level end of manufacturing industry. A couple of examples of the manufacturing industry and technologies Japan is using. So I thought this was an interesting picture. It's a circular loom for producing silk textiles, and you can see the way technology's moved on in the 120, 130 years since the pictures we saw of the spinning jenny and other types of new capital equipment that started to be used in the Industrial Revolution in Britain. This is an advertisement from the Kawasaki Dockyard Company, just making the point that sort of by the 1930s, Japan's starting to be a producer of goods like aeroplanes, trains, and large shipping. So moving in towards sort of the heavy or end of manufacturing industry. What were the elements that allowed to Japan to develop a manufacturing industry during this period, that allowed it to begin to converge towards, for example, many of the developed countries in Western Europe during this period? Well, one important point to note is that the later on we think about countries beginning to develop, of course, the gap between those countries and the technological leaders has got larger. The distance to converge becomes larger. So that means the scope to grow rapidly has increased, but of course it also means that you need to be bringing in a larger amount of capital. You need to be able to spend more to finance a larger amount of capital accumulation to get up to where the technological leader is. Japan has a couple of strengths in getting the capacity to finance this capital accumulation. One is that during the Meiji Restoration era, there are significant improvements in land productivity, in farming activity, and those prevent large increases in food prices during the industrialisation phase and facilitate capital accumulation. A second notable point about Japan is that it has exceptionally high savings rates from its own population. So rather than needing to, especially sort of in the later phase of industrialisation, of this phase of industrialisation, borrow a lot overseas to finance capital accumulation, Japan finances a large amount from domestic savings. And that's because with the rapid income growth that's occurring in Japan, there's more of a surplus that can then finance this investment activity. But as well, the Japanese population display a high capacity to abstain from consumption, to save rather than consume, to provide the basis for financing this capital accumulation. The second notable point about Japanese economic development and growth during this period is the way, the successful way in which they were able to take technology developed internationally and incorporate it into their industry. And so, early on, this was primarily a process of Japan copying and adapting technologies from overseas, evolving later on gradually to their own invention via having learned by doing the way technologies worked and then thinking about how they could be improved. A notable feature of Japan during this period was the speed with which it was able to adapt in these technologies from overseas. And as Gary Saxonhouse, an economic historian who's studied this period, says, slavish imitation of foreign technology is no easy matter. It's not just the matter of sort of going out and to a supermarket somewhere overseas and sort of finding the technology you need for producing a particular product like silk textiles and then bringing that back. Different countries overseas are using different technologies, or different firms are using different technologies. So you need to decide what the right technology or what the best technology is out of all these technologies that are being used. Then you've also got to think about which of those technologies is going to fit best into the environment in Japan, given the type of labour force that exists in Japan, given the institutional setup in Japan. So it's a significant achievement that Japan is able so rapidly to be able to bring in and build on this international technology. One of the factors that Saxonhouse emphasises as being particularly important in Japan was the cooperation between firms, that there ended up being a relatively high degree of homogeneity or similarity in Japan in the technology that textile firms use. And that's because there was this high degree of cooperation between them. Another distinctive aspect of Japanese development during this period was the role of firms. And so the Zaibatsu were a set of interrelated, interlocked commercial enterprises that included a bank that were usually controlled by a single family via a holding company. And so Mitsui and Mitsubishi would be examples of Zaibatsu. These Zaibatsu were very important through their relationship, for example, with the banks in being able to channel finance towards large industry. So a big question in economic in starting off development is this issue of how do you finance capital accumulation. And so I've just talked about, well, Japan had high savings rates, and that was a benefit to them in financing this investment. But another question is, how do you actually get those funds directed towards the activities which are going to allow you to industrialise? And the Zaibatsu played an important role here, increasingly important after World War I, in directing the available funds towards large heavy industry, the shipbuilding, the iron and steel industries, the machinery manufacturing, and so on. At the same time, it's important to recognise that Japan is, at this time, described as having a dual economy. So, whereas the Zaibatsu play an important role in the economy, it's still the case that there's a very large number of workers employed in relatively small-scale enterprises. I mentioned earlier in this section of the lecture the important nexus between Japanese economic development and national security, and through that, the military element in Japan. And so in this next part of the lecture, I'm going to take up this idea of the military element. The main underlying theme here is the idea that Japan was motivated to expand its territories as a basis for economic development, where economic development was seen as a major underpinning to national security. In 1894-95, Japan fights the Sino-Japanese War, and then in 1904-05, there's the war with Russia. And these battles are part of an ongoing attempt by Japan to gain resources through territorial expansion in parts of China. For example, as reparation payments from the Sino-Japanese War, Japan is able to gain an amount of gold, which allows it to move on to the gold standard. As well, it allows Japan to end the financial obligations it had with the Western powers under the treaty that had been negotiated in 1858. And Japan's overseas territories also become an important source of raw materials for industrialisation and of foodstuffs for the industrial workforce in Japan. The need to use its colonial markets becomes especially pronounced in the 1920s and 1930s. So growing population, growing industrialisation, increased Japanese demand for foodstuffs, increased demand for raw materials, and also the Great Depression, which reduces international demand for Japanese output, means that these colonial markets become increasingly important as a source of demand for Japanese exports. And so on the slide here, I've noted that by the late 1920s, Japan relies on Korea and Formosa, two of its overseas held territories, for 4/5 of its rice imports and 2/3 of its sugar imports. In the 1930s, Japan experiences some significant economic problems which give rise to or are associated with a battle for control of government between military and political moderates. So, for example, the Great Depression affects international demand for Japanese exports. Japan has major problems with asset price inflation coming out of the period of World War I, And also, Japan makes a mistimed decision of moving back onto the gold standard in 1930. And remember, the Great Depression's a period when countries are moving off the gold standard to give themselves greater flexibility to address the major decline in aggregate demand that's happening in that period. But Japan shifts back onto it at that time. So in the late 1920s, early 1930s is a period of major economic disruption in Japan that gives rise to this political tension. That tension is resolved really in favour of the military, and so from the 1930s onwards there's increased centralisation, a greater role of government and a greater role of the military in government. And essentially from the mid-1930s onwards, Japan becomes a war economy. That, of course, leads to that is associated with the onset of World War II. Japan's at war with China from 1937, at war in the Pacific with the US and its allies after 1941. And so you might remember from the introductory section of this lecture, the major disruption that World War II causes to economic activity in Japan. We'll come back at the start of the next section of the lecture to look again at that. But in this slide I've just shown the percentage of Japan's GDP that was being spent on military activity. And so, even during the late 1930s, that was about 20%. But when the, in particular, Pacific War is sort of fully underway, Japan is spending 50, 60, 70% of its GDP on wartime activity. So a way of summarising this period for Japan would be to say that it's a period of rapid economic growth by the standards of the day. It's a period where Japan really makes a remarkably quick transformation from being an agricultural, feudal economy. It's able to undo the institutions that had existed. It's able to adopt new institutions, its culture, allow it to industrialise exceptionally quickly. But at the end of the period, a lot of that is undone by Japan's involvement in wartime activity. And so the period of the 1930s is a period where, in some ways, Japan moves back against its earlier experience, well, in particular the 1940s, a period where Japan moves back against its experience of economic development in the preceding 6 decades or so. In the next section of this lecture, we'll take up the story after World War II, and we'll see that the World War, rather than constituting a turning point in Japan's economic experience, rather was an interruption on a continued path to economic development and progress.